Yaschica has announced a Kickstarter campaign for a new rangefinder style camera that uses some sort of digiFILM technology. Now, I was pretty critical of that Kickstarter campaign in a previous video, which I'll link a card to up here, but it's for good reason, because I've had experience with the Yaschica brand of years past, back in, when it was the Japanese company, and I know that they're capable of, making very quality cameras. So let's talk about one of those cameras. It's the sort of last in the line of the Yaschica rangefinder cameras, the Yaschica Electro 35 GSN. So the Yaschica Electro 35 GSN was the last in the line of rangefinder cameras that Yaschica made from about 1966 until 1977. Now, across that line, they made millions and millions of these cameras, so they're pretty easy to find on the used market, and they go for reasonable prices for what you get in a film rangefinder. It has an iconic vintage look, and it's a pretty iconic camera. It even makes a cameo in the movie The Amazing Spider-Man. Now, is it weird that in the movie they show a split image viewfinder that this camera does not have, and that the fact that that bothers me? I mean, come on, details, people, let's get it right. Anyway, the only real change between the models between the years is going to be the ISO dial and what values that it can take on, as well as the latest model has a hot shoe instead of a cold shoe. So it started with the Electro 35, then came the Electro 35G, which all it did was add the word color to the lens. And that was sort of to indicate to consumers that yes, the lens was corrected for color, because at that time, color film was becoming more accessible, more popular, and more affordable. So more people were shooting it. And they, it's kind of like branding. When digital cameras first came out, there's these filters, and there are 4 digital cameras. I mean, it doesn't really mean much because the lens hasn't changed in the entire lineup. After that came the GT and the GS. The GT was an all-black camera. The GS was a chrome camera. And the difference between those cameras between the previous model was that the ISO range went from, instead of 12 to 500, it went from 25 to 1000. And then came the last round, which is the GTN in black, and this, the GSN in chrome. And the addition there is of the hot shoe. Now, all the other models before it and this model have a PC port for flash sync, so you don't have to have a hot shoe to operate a flash. You just need a PC cord that goes from the camera to your flash. But if you want to use the hot shoe, you have to get the latest and greatest model, which is the GSN, or the GTN, which is the same model but in black. Like I said, it's the same exact lens across the entire line. It's a 45mm f1.7 lens. This one has the indication that it's 4-color film on it, but the lens itself is single-coated, not multi-coated, so it can be subject to lens flare, but it's a very high-quality lens for the price at the time, and I think it still holds up today. The aperture ranges from 1.7 up to f16, and the focusing distance goes from 0.8 meters or 2.6 feet all the way to infinity. So that aperture control is really all you have control over, because this is an aperture priority camera. So what that means is you're going to set the aperture on the by changing the aperture on the aperture ring here on the lens. And then what's going to happen is that the camera is going to choose the shutter speed for you. You don't really have control over the shutter speed. And the reason for that is this is sort of like the every person's camera. It's simple to use, and it was at the low to mid-range rangefinder sort of price point, and it was targeted towards that market. So it doesn't have the full manual features that some of the more advanced rangefinders have, but it was really used to sort of, make it so that, everyone could pick up this camera and start shooting right away. Now, there is a bulb setting for long exposures that you can set the camera to, as well as a flash setting that surprisingly, locks the shutter speed at 1/30th of a second for flash. Even though this camera should be able to sync at every single flash speed, because it has a leaf shutter, and we talked about leaf shutters in a previous video and how they can sync at every single flash speed. So if you haven't seen that video, I'll leave a tag up here. But the shutter is pretty quiet. I mean, it's not, like a quiet, but it's quiet. The film advance, this noise is much louder than the actual leaf shutter going off. As for metering, it's another very simple innovation as well. There's basically two lights on the top of the camera, a red warning light that says you're going to overexpose the image, and a yellow light that says you are going to use a slow shutter speed, 1/30th of a second or slower, which means that motion blur and camera shake might be a problem. So anything, if you see the yellow light, you can still take the picture because this has shutter speeds that range from 1/500th of a second all the way to 30 seconds automatic, which is, a huge range for the time. So if that yellow light comes on, just know that it's slower than 1/30th of a second. Now, it's not going to tell you what the shutter speed is, which is kind of unfortunate, but it gives you some sort of idea. So you know that if that yellow light comes on, you better hold really still or even preferably use a tripod. Now, there's a lot to like about this camera, so let's start off with what I don't like. First off, the camera is it's a bit bigger and a little heavier than other rangefinders of the era. So, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but if you're carrying this around all day and you have it on your neck and you're doing some street photography and it's kind of just hanging there, it's something to consider. It's a little bit bigger and heavier than other cameras of the time. Another thing I'm not crazy about is the focus throw. So the focus throw is sort of the distance that the focusing ring travels between minimum and maximum values. And basically here it is set at the minimum value, which is like right about here, and then it's about a quarter turn, that's it right there, to the infinity mark. So it's all personal preference at this point, but to me it feels like a little bit of a short throw, which is good if if you're running and gunning and you need to change quickly. You're not like cranking the lens over and over again to get to the exact focusing, but you lose out. It's a compromise, just like everything else in life and photography. It's a compromise between being able to nail that critical focus. So you don't have a lot of leeway, about, like I said, about 90 degrees between min and max. Again, not terrible, but something to consider. One thing that is a little bit more of annoyance is that they don't make the same battery that originally was used in this camera. So this camera used like a 5.6 volt mercury battery, and because mercury and EPA laws and that kind of stuff, that's pretty hard to find in most places in the world. There are some workarounds, and actually the circuitry is advanced enough in this camera to use a moderately wide range of voltages for batteries. So the other problem with the battery is the size. The battery compartment is actually pretty big because it was a big chunky battery back in the day. But you can actually tape a couple batteries together, and you have to get creative with some padding so that it doesn't wiggle around or jostle around in the battery compartment. So there are workarounds to that, but again, it's kind of inconvenient. You have to mix and match batteries in order to get it to work. And the battery is important because it controls the meter and it also controls the shutter. So this camera is not going to fire. And if it does fire, it might fire at the maximum shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. But I haven't tested it without the battery. I always have a battery in it to use it. So because the battery is not made anymore, you have to get creative with what kind of batteries do work and will actually operate the camera. There's a nice little battery check button that will turn this green. I don't know if you can see that, but it does show that it's working. And I'm using a combination of a 3-volt battery and two 1.5-volt batteries in here to get to that 6 volts, which will operate the camera without any noticeable change to metering settings. So sometimes when you use voltages that are not recommended for that camera, lower or higher, it's going to throw off the meter because the meter is using the electricity to meter the scene. So if that voltage is off and the circuitry can't handle it, your metering readings are going to be completely out of whack, even though the camera might be operable. Lastly, the one thing that can be bothersome in tricky lighting situations is that this camera has no exposure lock, or it doesn't have exposure compensation dials. So if you're trying to take a picture of a complex lighting situation, say someone is backlit, normally with more advanced cameras you have sort of an exposure lock where you could either get in close to the person, take your meter reading, lock it, back up, expose, and and basically compose the shot and take the shot using the metering reading off the person. Or if you had full manual control, you could easily switch a couple stops around to get the right lighting conditions and the right exposure for the camera. Now, because no matter what aperture you put this on, it's going to select the shutter speed automatically, you don't have that option of manual control, and there's no exposure lock or exposure compensation dial that is going to actually let you change what the camera thinks is right. So the only way around that is to actually change the ISO dial and basically fudge what the camera thinks is the correct exposure by changing these values on top here. Other than that, for what it is, user-friendly aperture priority rangefinder, I mean, this is a really fun camera to use, and it's capable of making some stunning photographs. So as far as operation goes, it's pretty simple. You're going to first set your ISO setting to whatever you're going to use for that film, whether it be box speed or if you know you're going to push or pull process the film, set it to whatever you think is appropriate for that roll of film. You're going to dial in your aperture using the aperture ring, and then you're just going to simply take the photograph. So it's pretty simple. Now, what happens is that when these warning lights come on, then you have to sort of, give more consideration to what you're doing. So if, let's see if I can get it to trip here. So if, for example, the red light comes on, that means that the picture is overexposed. Too much light is going into the camera, and what happens is the red light comes on, and inside the viewfinder there is actually a red light that will come on, and it points to the right. And when it points to the right, my right, as you're using the camera, there's actually a red arrow on the aperture dial telling you to turn the aperture to the right. So if you're, sort of looking through the lens of the camera, back of the camera through the lens, turning to the right would be clockwise, but there's actually, there's little arrows on the thing, so you just turn it to the right. It's pretty intuitive once you get one of these in your hands. So you're going to turn that until you stop down the lens until it's above that 1/500th of a second shutter speed. Now, if you have not enough light, like if I fudge the camera by setting the ISO to 25, and I put it at f16, you're going to get a yellow light on top of the camera. And basically what that means is that you're going to have a slow shutter speed. That means slower than 1/30th of a second. So it could be 1 second, it could be 5 seconds, it could be 30 seconds. You don't know. You just know that it's going to be slow to get the proper exposure. Now, in order to do that, in order to remedy that, basically what's going to happen is you push on this button, the slow warning light comes on, there's an arrow inside that points to the left, so you can turn the aperture dial to the left in order to let more light into the camera, open up the aperture, and get the proper exposure. Now, one really interesting and quirky thing about this camera is the actual shutter button itself. There's a lot of play in the shutter button. What I mean by that is you have to push this pretty far down to get a photograph. There's a lot of travel, more so than you're used to, especially, people who shoot DSLRs, there's like the push for half focus and then the full shot. I mean, it's very minuscule, that amount of travel. This probably goes down a full centimeter before it actually engages the shutter. And these lights come on at different times. So when you push this shutter down, if the picture is overexposed, the red light will light up first. If it's going to light up, it will light up about 1/3 of the way down when you press the button. The yellow light lights up afterwards about 2/3 of the way when you press the button. So it may be the case that you have to kind of have a soft touch and kind of finesse the shutter, which is good practice anyway, right? Because you should be sort of slowly pressing the shutter and engaging the shutter to avoid camera shake. You shouldn't be jerking the shutter down. I mean, that was way exaggerated, but you get the idea. You shouldn't be forcefully kind of hitting the shutter because it's going to introduce camera shake. So you kind of really have to have a soft touch when it comes to this shutter if you want to go by these lights and make sure that you're not going to be over or underexposed, or you're going to be using a super slow shutter speed. So just you're going to slowly press down, and when you see no warning lights, then you know you're good when you get towards the bottom, and then you take the shot. Now, focusing is achieved through a split image viewfinder, which means that there's actually a viewing window, which is this first window, which goes straight to the back of the viewfinder in the camera, so you get to see exactly what is going on in the scene. And then there's a little window here that has a little diamond on it, and that's going to project a diamond image. And when that image sort of lines up with what you see, and they overlap, and there's no like mismatch, you're not seeing double, that's when the picture is in focus. So what's really cool about this camera for its time, I mean, most modern rangefinders have this, but it actually corrects for parallax. So parallax basically means that what you look through in this viewfinder in this direction is slightly different than the view from the lens, because you're not in the same plane. It's not an SLR where you're actually using a mirror to look through the lens. You have a viewfinder window and the lens, and they see slightly different things. But what you see as you focus this lens, you're actually going to see these frame lines. So there's these yellow frame lines inside the camera viewfinder, and they actually move on a diagonal, which is actually pretty cool. So as you focus, you see them move. So the frame lines actually adjust for your focusing distance, so that when you get up close to something, it's not as, the parallax error is corrected by using those moving frame lines, which is great. The metering is also a pretty simple mechanism. It's this little window here, And basically what happens is as you dial in the ISO, there's just these two shutter curtains like this that kind of open and close to let more or less light into sort of the sensor that's sensing the light. And it's pretty mechanical. So, you know, at high ISOs, you're gonna have a wide open thing because it's letting more light in, and at low ISOs, you're gonna have those windows closed up so it lets less light in. So based on the relative light that's coming in, based on the ISO setting, that's how the camera meters. So it's all around, it's pretty simple. And that's really all you need to know about the camera. I mean, it's a fun camera to shoot. It's very intuitive once you get used to it. It's a very short learning curve. It's supposed to be, you know, pretty much automatic, and you know, anyone can pick this up and shoot. You just have to know a little bit about exposure, but even if you don't know that much about exposure, there's literally arrows that just tell you, okay, turn the aperture ring this way or that way to get something that's the correct exposure. Now I'm planning on actually making a few more videos detailing sort of the like a walk around of the camera, showing you all its features and all the buttons and what they do, and some close-up shots. And I'm gonna, you know, start shooting with this camera and taking you along for the ride, shooting film this camera and showing you some of the images that it produces. So the best way to stay up to date on future videos is to make sure that you're subscribed to this channel with notifications enabled so that you know when those videos come out. So if you want to stay up to date on that latest content, remember to hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and smash that like button to stay up to date and be aware of any future updates that this channel provides on this and other topics. And until then, as always, happy shooting.